Got it. So after about 10 years, and all you folks on this call have done this work yourselves, you know that if you've been investigating a 1,000-acre refinery or a 350-acre chemical plant, you know about 10 years in what your problem is and how you're going to resolve it. And so starting 10 years later in 2002, the remediation of these industrial sites started, and it included finding thousands of drums still filled with tars and acids that you see to the left, USTs to the right. Next. Drums that were burned and then buried, LNAPL, and also remediation trenches that I built and designed that separated the sites from the sensitive receptor. So now you're starting to get site containment. Next slide. And it's only after you achieve that you really can calculate NRD. But I've inserted these 3 images here to give credit to the team that has helped me in the first 15 years of this work. To the upper left is Suzanne Eckel, to the right is Bren Welker, and to the lower left is Sophia Lee. These young women helped me enormously doing much of the field work as I worked with them. And without their work, none of this would have been possible. I'm very gratified to say that each of these individuals, exceptional individuals, still work in this business, but have gone on out beneath my shadow and have started careers and are running projects similar to these on their own. In fact, Sophia works for a major oil company, and Bren and Suzanne are project managers at highly regarded consulting firms. So before I proceeded, I wanted to make sure that no one person does this work. That if you don't have a good team with you, and I just happen to be very fortunate with these 3 young women, that they were equal members of the team and performed very arduous and difficult tasks. And a lot of the success of the investigation, the remediation, were due to their efforts. Next slide. So about 2 years into the remediation in 2004, I knew enough about how long that remediation would take so that I could calculate the natural resource damages. One thing about natural resource damages is it's ongoing right now, but you can't settle it unless you know when it's going to end, when the injury is going to end. You can advance, next slide, or next. Yeah. So, but what is a natural resource? Probably should have defined this up front, but this is the actual legal definition. It is land, fish, wildlife, biota, air, water, groundwater, and drinking water supplies and other resources that are held in trust by the United States on behalf of citizens like you and I, or any local Native American tribe. So each of these facilities damaged natural resources, and this is different than remediation. A company has an obligation to remediate their contamination under state law, in particular in New Jersey. However, there are federal laws that say that if you've taken that natural resource out of service, you owe the citizens of the United States compensation for that loss. It doesn't matter whether or not they were using the resource at the time. We're not going to attempt to tease out whether or not they didn't use the resource because it was contaminated or they didn't know it existed. The courts have defined that if an industry takes away a natural resource takes away a natural resource from a citizen, it owes compensation for that loss, even if that resource is remediated. Next slide. So how is damage defined? It's the discharge of a hazardous substances or oil that causes the loss of a natural resource service, and it's calculated from the time of injury through full recovery. Next. Now, I could do an entire presentation on that image to the lower right. It's how I calculated what service losses were incurred, in this particular case, from a site that started in 1915 and was remediated only in the late 1990s. Next. But as a thumbnail, you start with the number of acres that were affected. Next. And over time, that acres increases of what you owe the public. So if you injured 20 acres in 1915, you don't owe the public 20 acres in 2022. It accrues over time. So in this particular case, it was 380 acres that were owed back to the public, even though it only started out as originally a 20-acre injury back in 1915. but I'll probably do another presentation someday on how complicated this formula is. But when I calculated this NRD and the trustees, the federal and state trustees, we agreed that this was fair compensation. So just give you an example that you can understand in acre currency. Let's say that 20 acres of wetlands in 1915 were damaged. If I build or restore 383 acres today, that's compensation for the fact that those 20 acres of wetlands had been injured for almost 100 years. So time is a parameter in NRD. Next. So I wanted to get that out of the way because you may be wondering what that does have to do with dam removals. Well, I had to give you the context of why these projects occurred. So next. So in 2008, I spent almost the entire year after we knew when our sites were going to be remediated, try to figure out the 3 NRDs, how were we going to compensate the public for this loss? Now for groundwater, which is a resource, the primary option is to purchase some uncontaminated land, put it in the easement. It recharges clean water in the same supply area that the contaminated site was in, and that compensates for that contaminated groundwater. Next. The example I just showed is that if we damage 20 wetland acres in 1915 and I restore 383, that is the primary way that you compensate the public for wetlands loss. But next, but the river. This was a real puzzle to us. How does one settle a river injury? And in 2008, nobody knew how to do this. Next slide. So I sat down with DEP and U.S. Fish and Wildlife and NOAA and said, okay, my client injured this river in the 20th century. It's clean now. Sediment's been remediated, the site no longer discharges. But I had 80 years, 70 years of damage, of discharges into this river of untreated chemicals. How do I possibly compensate the public for that injury? We decided that reestablishing anadromous, which is migratory fish passage in an unobstructed river into their historically significant spawning grounds would be the action that would provide the greatest uplift. So it turned out that dam removals, next, would be the mechanism to restore a river and get that ecological uplift. So the next slide, next, you'll see that the dam miraculously disappears. Next, and that in theory, migratory fish would return. Next. So here's some interesting quotes. If you're not familiar with dams, we all know the benefit of dams. Why? They generate hydropower. They might be the place where your water company extracts water from. They might, in the west, not the east, serve as some function of flood control. But they do more damage than good. Most dams do more damage than good. So here's an interesting couple quotes from a report. The ascent of shad and anadromous fishes is entirely prevented by a dam, completely preventing the ascent of fishes above this point. Next. Few fish have spawned in the Raritan since the erection of the dam. Next. The chief cause of the local extirpation of fish is the erection of dams impassable by anadromous fish returning through their spawning grounds. Now, you might think that this might have been a report that I wrote in 2008 justifying dam removals. Next. But in fact, these words were written about this dam, next, in this report from 1872. So it was recognized 150 years ago, the negative consequences of dams. But in the industrial rush to improve life for the citizens of this country, dams were built almost without thinking. It's been said there's been a dam built every day in this country since the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and the number of dams, depending on how you define a dam, whether it's a weir, or whether it's 5 feet high or lower, there's been at least 350,000 dams in this country and perhaps over 1 million river obstructions, which include culverts. Next slide. So what are the advantages? How did we justify to the trustees that a dam removal would do the thing that they wanted, which was to compensate the public, the citizens of New Jersey, for the damages from my client's sites? Well, number one, as I said before, it would reestablish unobstructed, free-flowing river conditions and restore the river bottom substrates that are ideal for spawning. And you'll see a video of this algae later. That's me and my kayak. And this is a river that I'm sitting in above one of the dams. And then this picture to the lower right is what that stretch of river looked like after the dam was removed. I think you might be able to guess which one the fish prefer. Next slide. And then the next advancement. Number 2, you restore the river's processes for natural deposition, its flood flow and its water chemistry. You no longer have deoxygenated impoundments, but you have high DO water, flowing water that is not accumulating a lot of phosphates and nitrates, in still water. Next slide. And then the next advancement. You're also, when you clean that river and you get that river flowing again, you restore riparian habitat and you increase biodiversity. I can tell you that every time we took a dam down, the birds showed up that afternoon watching us, wondering if it was finally going to bring the river back to life. We've noticed almost a tripling of bird populations in the former dam impoundment since these dams came down. Next slide. And then next advancement. There's been a study by U.S. Fish and Wildlife that for each river mile that is opened, it puts $500,000 into the local economy per year for the following 10 years. And you can figure out why. It's rather intuitive. People want to canoe, they want to kayak, they want to fish, they want to swim. They are going to use this river, whereas before, in fact, some of my dams, they were restricted for using the river because of the fear of going over the dam and drowning. Next advancement. So we want to go from just me and my little yellow kayak on this river to having dozens of people come out and enjoy the river's recreational use. Next slide. And then lastly, this dam, the Robert Street Dam, which we're going to talk about in just a few minutes, had a number of human fatalities during the time that I was studying the dam and when it was rebuilt in 1964. And then this deer went over the dam one morning that I was there, and there was no saving it. And so this is a good example of these dams. These low-head dams are drowning machines, and that it's very difficult to extradite yourself. So the dam I'm working on now had 7 fatalities. The Robert Street Dam had 3. Some of the other dams that I took down at least had 1 or 2 fatalities in the historical period. So we are also improving public safety. Next slide. So I thought this would be, and then you can advance it again. I thought this would be useful to kind of show you how long it takes to plan one of these projects. So as you saw, in 2008, I worked out a deal that dam removals would be the way to compensate the public. So starting in 2009, and I do this to the present day, I'm planning, permitting, and preparing for dam removals. Now, there's been 2 phases, 2011 and 2017, which I'll talk about today, and then the phase that I'm in right now, which is 2018 to 2024, which is the second phase of dam removals. And I'll explain why they were divided up into 2 phases in a moment. Next slide. So where are these dams? The 4 that I've done and the one that I'm working on now. Next. So the first dam on the Millstone River was the Weston Mill Dam. And you can see a picture of that dam to the upper right. Next. The lowermost Raritan Dam was the Calco Dam. It was actually a weir that was built by American Cyanamid to discharge waste dye into the river, but it served both as a dam and as a weir. Next. This is the Nevia Street Dam, built in 1901 by James Buchanan Duke of Duke Farms. He built it to run a power station. That's just out of the frame of the picture. Next. And then the topic for the rest of this afternoon will be the Robert Street Dam here. And then you can advance it one more time. There's also a Headgates Dam that is off of the frame of the picture to the left that I'm working on currently. So I'm going to show you the status of each of these 4 dam removals, but we're going to spend most of our time for the remainder 30 minutes on the Robert Street Dam, which is to the lower left. Next slide. So I just want to give you a snapshot in these slides what the last 5-year process looks like. So in year 1, you're identifying the dam, you're trying to figure out who owns it, which is trickier than it sounds, And then you're also trying to figure out whether it's feasible to deconstruct it. Next. In year 2, you're spending a lot of time monitoring the river. You need to know the behavior of the river to try to pick a time when you might be able to do the demolition. You're also sampling sediments behind the dam. You're surveying the dam. You're surveying the riverbed at this time. Next. In year 3, you're doing a lot of your analysis. You have to notify every dam owner on the river on the impoundment, which sometimes can be hundreds of homes. And you're also modeling the river because you have to figure out when is the ideal flow to breach it. One does not breach a dam on any given day. You want to breach it at its low flow condition to minimize sediment moving through the breach, and also to make it safe for your contractor to be in the water, as you'll see in a few moments, breaching the dam. So the modeling tells you, you build a model of the dam and the river, and it allows you to predict how much sediment and how much flow is going through the dam when you breach it. Next. Year 4, which is the next advancement here, is you are getting agreements with the dam owner. Sometimes I have dams that no one wants to claim to own, so we make them sign a quit claim deed that says, even though you say you're not the owner, we think you're the owner, but if you want to say that you're not the owner, you're going to allow us to take down the dam that you don't own, and you're not going to make us put it back up if you end up owning it. So sometimes we have to do that because no dam owner wants to be on record as being the actual owner because they understand the liability. You're also trying to figure out how to get to the dam with 40-ton equipment. And then, of course, as you might all imagine in all your projects, you're applying for your permits and you're doing your public notices and you're doing your historical research in that year before the demolition takes place. Next slide. And then in year 5, you're bidding out your contractors, you're getting your approvals. Many of my dams have an eagle nest next to them. And so we have to make sure that the eagles fledge by mid-July, and then you do that demolition typically in year 5. Next slide. So now we finally get to talk about the dam that I wanted to show you today. This is the Robert Street Dam. It's actually called the Dead River Dam when it was built in 1915 because of what it did to the river. And yet it was somewhat robotically replaced in 1964 when the dam failed. Next. Oops, go back. And then this is, Amy, where you go to the lower left corner of the image and hit play. Right there. So this is going to be a little jerky, but this is me in the impoundment of the Robert Street Dam a year before the removal took place. This is what is covering the surface water right now, is filamentous and other mat algae. And this is just simply not a very healthy condition for a river to be in. This literally didn't flow, and it got carpeted with this algae. What you really want, and what fishes really want, is they want to be in open water like this. And then this very last video that's going to come up, I would tell you to look at the bottom of the screen. You're going to see a shad attempting a jump, and it didn't play very well. But many shad would get up to this dam and not be able to crest it. Shad cannot jump over obstructions this large. Next. So in trying to figure out how to take down this dam, you would try to acquire as much information as you can. There are really no as-built for dams this old, so you're doing a lot of surface observation. I also cored the top of this dam to try to figure out what was beneath it. Next. And then, of course, you can make a lot of observations when you're looking at the dam. So I found a picture from 1964 in a newspaper of what the dam looked like. So that told me a great deal about how they built it. Next. I could walk out onto the dam at very low flow and see a cutoff wall that was on the upstream side, a series of sweet sheet piles. So then I knew that we had a big challenge in front of us because all of those sheet piles would have to be removed. We had no depths of these sheet piles, but we knew they probably were down into bedrock. Next. This is a picture also from a consultant report that I was able to obtain from a consultant from 1963 of the original dam, the Dead River Dam that had sunk and failed in 1963. So now I know generally, I could tell even in a picture of this quality, I knew that was also a concrete dam as well. So that prepared me to do a double dam removal. Next. And then, of course, I could see where riprap had been placed on the backside of the dam to sort of ramp up and get water over the sheet piles. Next. But then I should tell you, there are things that you don't know. No one could tell me the composition of this stone fill. So I had to be flexible as soon as we broke into this in deciding what to do with it. Next. These next series of slides, I just wanted to show you that this is a technical process that requires engineering drawing. So here's an engineering drawing, a site plan of the dam and where I'm going to breach. I'm going to breach all the way to the left at the farthest end of the dam. Next. I did a cross-section profile of that very same cross-section to show the agencies what I was planning to remove and the grading that I was going to do through the dam. Next. And then you can advance it one more time after this. And then the river surveying that you do upstream of the downstream of the dam tells you where the river thalweg is. And of course, it's no longer existing at the dam, but it tells you how to connect the two thalwegs together to reconnect the river. So that's why you survey the river up and downstream to try to figure out the geometry of what it used to look like so that you could recreate it when you remove the dam. Next. So the next slide will show, if you could advance the next slide. Great. You can just advance through these. I just wanted to illustrate there are a number of permits, 5 in all, including public notice that one has to apply for to remove a dam. So this takes about a year to do. And then of course, the public has to be notified and also approve of the project. So next, we have to public notice both the dam permit and the freshwater permit. Next. And so that's what typical public notice looks like right there, where you're notifying the folks that you want to permanently breach this dam. This allows people that aren't even on the dam impoundment to comment on the dam removal. Next. Now I'm going to just spend a few minutes talking about challenges. Every dam removal that I've done has had a unique challenge. And I wanted to share with you a few of the unique challenges with this, because one, it's not as simple as getting all my permits and going out and removing this dam. So what I have here is, you see to the right an eagle's nest, you see to the left a dam. The New Jersey folks felt like this proximity was too close. Luckily, Duke Farms had a camera in this nest or above this next, where we could monitor the fledgling of the eagle. And so obviously when you're planning this, I just can't call a contractor and say, come out today and do the dam. They had to have months of notice. So I had to work very closely with folks to predict the date that the eagle would fledge so that we could begin the construction. Next slide. Next. Unluckily for this dam, there was virtually no way to get to it. Next. There was only one road, right where you see Robert Street Bridge, and this bridge was not capable of supporting the load from our equipment. So getting to the dam, and I know this might sound odd to say this is in a remote location in Somerset County, New Jersey of all places, but the fact is there was only one direct road to get here, and we couldn't go on that road for the reasons I'll explain in the next slide. So this was the bridge. I'm not an engineer, but one look at this, I realized that there wasn't any way that this bridge could hold a 40-ton excavator. If just because they were sandbagging the abutment, they had a hollow metal pipe on a concrete pad, which by the way this is a canal, which wasn't even attached to the canal, the base of the canal. So I did a lot of geotechnical borings in here next, and realized that this bridge could not hold the weight of the excavator. Next slide. So now I have a problem on my hands. I've gotten permission to remove the dam, but I have no way of getting there. Next. So I've already shown you this bridge, can't be used. Next. You might think about the real estate next door on the other side of the river, but there was no road. The bald eagle's nest was there, and then we'd have to cross under PSE&G power lines, which they would not allow us to do. Next. Luckily, there was another bridge in Duke Island Park that was rated for 63 tons. So I was able to take that, and this was all pre-planned. I'm showing you the end result. Was able to ride the excavators down the pathway. And then where you see that yellow arrow stop, you might be able to look in the river and see some brown sediment in there on the north margin of the river. That's actually a sandbar that I surveyed over many, many months and realized that at a particular water depth, our equipment could ride on that sandbar next and be able to get past that pedestrian bridge, which was blocking our way next, and be able to get to the dam. And that's what it looked like. We made it by a few inches. I walked ahead of this excavator and I said, if you see the water go over my head, don't stop. We were able, you normally don't approach a dam on the impoundment side because the water is too deep. I'm going to return to this sandbar later on to show you what became of it. But I just wanted to illustrate to you that every dam removal has challenges, but if you work a problem long enough, you'll be able to come up with a solution. Next. So now we get to be the fun part, the latter portion of our presentation where we talk about how the dam removal happened. Next. First, we had to build an access ramp to get onto the apron of the dam, and then we rolled our excavators out on the appointed day where our breaching calculations said that at this particular flow, 280 CFS, we could breach the dam safely. Next. And next. We took our 2.5 ton, 60 BPM hydraulic hammer and began to hammer away at the concrete. Our objective for this day, because you have to breach in a single day, was to uncover the sheet piles and either remove them or bend them downward to begin the impoundment draining. Next slide. And then next. So here you see us, it's about 1 o'clock in the afternoon now. We have removed the concrete apron from the top of the dam, and we were able to pull out the sheets on the down gradient side, but time was starting to run short. So all we did on the back sheets was bend the sheets down to allow the impoundment to drain and control the flow of water. So I actually used those sheet piles as weirs to govern the flow, the discharge, which really kept sediment from discharging out, which is what dam safety was there for. They wanted to make sure that we weren't discharging so much sediment that had been impounded upstream that we were covering habitat downstream. Next. And then when the initial breaching is over, you work for the next couple of weeks to widen the breach. And our objective here was to remove the concrete to get at the sheet piles. Because you'll remember now, according to the drawing I showed, sheet piles formed both the cutoff wall on the upstream side, but also supported the dam crest on the downstream side. Next. And then next. It took about a week for this impoundment to drain. That's how much water was stored in it. It went up miles and miles, almost to the next dam. And so you can see my kayak there, which used to be water. And you can tell what used to be underwater, which is things that don't have vegetation. And then we also did some freshwater mussel rescue during this time while those guys were breaching the dam. We actually found some adult freshwater mussels that we relocated into the water to save them for future reproduction. Next slide. And then next. What was really interesting is now that you've got the dam cut open, you could do an autopsy. So I see some stone fill there to the upper left. And then if you just advance one more, we're going to do an autopsy of the dam. That's obviously the back sheet pile. Next. That's the original dam. Didn't know it was going to be orange. That told me that they actually mixed the concrete on site using Raritan River sediment and not aggregate that was shipped in 1915. So I thought that was interesting. And there, finally, I lay eyes on the stone fill. I now know it's an R4 size rock. It's going to run from 12 inches to 24 inches. And now I have a few days to think about what I'm going to do with that rock now that I know what it is. So next question. Next slide. And then next. So this is the most critical stage. We have to get these sheet piles out or it's not really a dam removal. So we spent 2.5 weeks uncovering the sheet piles on both the upstream side and the downstream side. Next slide. And these were U-shaped piles, and they had Union straight web section interlocks. Now, they weren't grouted. I know there looks like there's grout in there, but that was actually grout from the concrete apron. They actually were not grouted in place. They were just simply driven into place. And so I don't want you to think that everything went perfect on this job. Nothing ever does. I will tell you that when I spec'd out this 1.6 ton suspended weight vibratory extractor that had a 16-ton line pull, which is that 16-ton LP, I came to find out very soon that that was woefully undersized. Next slide. I had to upgrade to a model 1123. Next slide. We needed a much heavier, because the way that you break the seal is you literally drop the extractor on the sheet pile to break the seal, and then it had to have at least a higher vibration per minute, 2100 vibrations per minute, and it had to have a 16-ton line pull, because these sheets don't weigh 40 tons, but they are driven into bedrock, have been naturally cemented into bedrock, and are now rusted shut in their interlocks with every other sheet pile. So it took a 40-ton line pull to pull them. Next. And so if you could play this, I know it might be jumpy, but you should be able to still get a flavor of the deconstruction. It also had an audio, but I don't think you can hear that. So here we are demolishing the dam crest. If you could hear the audio, it's a loud rackety rack pounding of the rock as this vibratory hammer slams into this concrete and shatters it. It's quite an impressive process, and laborious too. So what we're doing here is we're exposing the 1964 sheet piles, because we're not going to be able to grab onto these sheet piles with the extractor until we can get about a foot grip on them. So we had to strip the concrete off of both sides of these sheet pile, on both sides. Now, by the way, what are we doing with the concrete? Well, we're taking it out in really large sections, because I made a commitment to DEP dam safety that I would not leave an ounce of concrete in this river because it didn't belong there. You are allowed to petition to leave concrete in. I didn't think that was going to look very good. So I made the commitment to not only excavate the rock fill, which you see us doing here, excavate the original dam, but make sure that all of the 1964 concrete got removed. And this vibratory extractor started doing a pretty decent job. However, if this video were to run, you would see that it's now straining to try to break the seal on these sheet piles. And we didn't want to burn it out, so we knew about day 2 that this extractor was not up to the task of doing it. So we brought in the 1123, and it made very short work of these sheets. But I have a zoom in here, but you can see that sometimes the metal would actually go molten before the seal was broken. That's how attached they were. And as this sheet comes up, you're going to see a lot of red sediment on the bottom. That's bedrock that had cemented to the sheet. So we're literally breaking rock. The adhesion to the sheet was stronger than the rock to itself, which is why much of the 5 weeks that it took to remove this dam was dedicated to removing these 300 sheets. And I know there were 300 because every one was a struggle to get out. And so we pulled out all 300 sheets. I left sheets up against the 2 retaining walls as an anchor, but all the other sheets came out. And by this time, I knew what I was going to do with the rock fill. I was going to use it to support the walls that the dam owner wanted to keep for bank stabilization. So I found a way to repurpose that rock. Next slide. There's a YouTube video that I have that would play in normal speed if you're interested. I have those links at the end of the presentation. So we're rounding up here. We just have a few minutes left. Next slide. As I just said in the video, I repurposed the rock fill and rebuilt the shorelines. You may know that dams scour out the shoreline upstream of the dam. They create coves, and so we use the rock to rebuild the shoreline. Next slide. And then next. Now you might ask, I do have some removals where we are responsible for revegetating the riparian zone. We didn't have to do this in this particular case. This actually reseeded itself within a year. So that's the same view a year later. The river comes in, carries so much mud and so many seeds that basically we didn't have any exposed surfaces a year after the dam was removed. Next slide. And then next. As I said, I made a firm commitment that I wanted people to go to this location and ask, what dam? Where was it? And the way that you do that is you clean up after yourself. And so I made sure that every piece of steel that we got out and every ounce of concrete was shipped off and recycled, not disposed of. Next slide. And I'm rather fastidious about this. I wanted to know exactly how much we moved off. So you can do 2 more advancements here. So I can tell you we moved out 70 tons of steel and 700 tons of concrete. They got recycled at a metal recycling facility and also at Boulder's concrete recycling off of Route 22. Next slide. And this video is very, very short. It's a before and after of some views of the dam. It may be jumpy, but I still think you'll get a flavor of what the before and after look like for the dams, for this particular dam. So this is a view from the south bank looking north when the dam is gone. And then I have a couple downstream camera positions that I had set up, and the video makes it look like the dam vanished. And it really becomes a different river, completely transformed. Next slide. So I did mention that there were other projects. And you can just advance one more. The Robert Street Dam is accounted for here, as is the Cowco, Nevius, and Robert Street dams, and then the Weston Mill Dam, and then Headgates. And if you look to the upper right, once the last dam comes down, 28.7 miles of the river will be free from obstructions. And this, by the way, we're about 30, Cowco Dam was about 30 miles from the ocean. That was really not spawning habitat. It was these 30 miles, these 28.7 miles that are the historical spawning grounds. So there have been dam removals elsewhere in the country that open up 40 miles of river, and those are fantastic. New Jersey being New Jersey, I had 5 dams within 28 miles. And once the last dam comes down the Headgates, I believe that the majority of the historical spawning area of shad will be restored for them to come and resume their spawning in the river. Next slide. So just a quick snapshot of the other projects. Next. This is the Cowco Dam, the furthest one downstream. Next. Every project has some other ancillary benefit. So how did I get the owner to agree on this dam? Well, they were partially owner of the Delaware and Raritan Canal, which you see to the left in the lower right photo. I demonstrated to them that the presence of the dam was scouring into this berm that had been built in 1833 that was being used for water supply by New Jersey American Water. So if you advance it one more, I made a commitment to them that not only would I remove the dam, I would rebuild the berm for them and give that another, hopefully 150 years of life. Next slide. So they found that to be a win. Next. This is the Nevius Street Dam that Duke Farms was using for water supply. Next. This was the intake that you see here to the lower right. And if you advance it one more, you'll see that once the dam came down, the intake essentially went dry. So how did I remedy these folks? I designed and constructed 2 water wells and reconfigured their groundwater system on the facility, next slide, or next advancement, and replaced their surface water with groundwater. Not only was it more reliable, it didn't have the phosphates and nitrates that were fouling their lakes with algae. So how did Duke Farms win? Well, they got rid of a liability, just like the Cowco Dam owner, but they also got better water quality for their lakes, a more reliable system, and now their lakes are improving, as is the overall habitat. So again, these projects work because everybody should win, and everybody should win on these. And so Duke Farms got rid of a liability, but also got a better water supply in exchange for their agreement to allow me to remove this dam. Next slide. And then the last example I'll show you is the Weston Mill Dam. I did this only a few years ago. That's me standing on the impoundment. This dam actually was originally built in 1747, so I had a lot of SHPO work that I had to do to justify the removal of this structure. It was on the verge of collapse, which kind of helped my case. Next. This was a beautiful mill that had been here, but it had burned down in 1993. Next. But I was able to promise that after the dam was removed, I would do an archaeological recovery of the dam and the mill. Next. And then I would put scour protection around the mill foundation and preserve it for future generations. And one of my true pleasures was writing about a 100-page report on the archaeology of this. And it was so fascinating to review the history of this mill. It's the first dam that SHPO has allowed to be removed in New Jersey that had a prior life as a grist mill. I'm not suggesting all of them should be dammed. In fact, there's one at Clinton that is not in shad habitat that should remain because the mill is still there. However, this will open the door for other people who are looking at old grist mill dams and removing them because, yes, the dam is gone. However, by removing the dam, you save the mill structure from flooding and damage. And so the exchange in SHPO's minds was worth it. Next slide. So we're just going to revisit this slide. I showed you this earlier. If you just want to advance, if you look to the upper right, that was the Weston Mill Dam. And now it is gone. And if you look to the lower right, the Cowco Dam, if you advance it, and advance again in the middle picture, and advance it one more time for the Robert Street, which we just spent this afternoon speaking about. And next slide. So you might be thinking, okay, John, looks good, I guess. How did it turn out? Next. I have to caveat this because you might suspect that shad populations have a lot of other factors involved, including whether or not someone's fishing for the shad offstream. Offshore. But taking all these factors into consideration, next. And you can advance. There is an order of magnitude increase in shad and herring that are moving upriver. And to this day, I still get anglers sending me pictures of shads they are catching where the former dams were. Next. And then the newspapers have given us an excellent coverage, really fair and honest coverage that the results of this work have improved the habitat of the river. Next slide. And then I promised to show you what happened to that sandbar. So if you just want to advance the next four advancements, this is what it looked like in the upper left when it was still algae covered. That was a year to the upper right where it was then exposed. No longer a sandbar underwater, but now an island. And then as the natural habitation or vegetation moves in to the lower left, and then this is what it looked like just a few years ago. There's actually sycamores and other native willows growing on this island. You would never know if you walked up to here that 8 years prior to that picture in the lower right that this was 3 feet underwater. Next slide. I'm proud to say, and you can just advance through all of these, that these projects have been awarded multiple awards from very respected organizations, which really encouraged my client to keep going. Normally, they don't tend to get awards for their work. So these awards were really appreciated by me in particular because it showed that there is a way to get responsible industries not only to step up and take responsibility for their past damage, but to go and perform projects for millions of dollars that rectify those damages. So I'm very proud of my clients for having that moral sense of responsibility. Next slide. And then the very last thing I'd like to show you before we end today is this is the dam I'm currently working on and have been working on since 2009. And you can just advance the next four. I have a sewer line behind the dam. Remember I said every dam had its challenges? Well, I have a sewer line behind the dam that I have to move that's actively being used. This has 3 rows of sheet pile and there are different configurations. So I'm currently figuring out how to remove those. The dam was built in 1842 to put water into a canal, the Raritan Power Canal that flowed down to the borough of Raritan, next advancement. And so I have to maintain water flow into this canal. And to do that, I'm speccing out, perhaps drilling a water supply well and pouring that water into the canal, because once the dam is removed, the water flow into this canal will dry up. Next. And I think if you just advance it one more time, these are the videos that I have that go into detail. When I started this project, I really couldn't find learning. I flew around the country, talked to people about dam removals, American Rivers and others, but there was no sort of tutorial online, which we all kind of expect there is. There is if you want to change a light switch, but there wasn't one for dam removal. So I took it on myself to actually create videos of each of these projects that are that illustrate the process on how these were removed. And if you don't want to write down all these things, if you just write down my name, YouTube, and dam removals, these videos will come up. And then the final slide is my thank you for your attendance today, and take on any questions. I know we used the full hour. I apologize, but if you'd like to stay on and ask some questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Oh, thanks so much for that presentation, John. It was really interesting. If I had my volume on, you would have been hearing my woes and wows. We do have plenty of questions on the chat. I don't know if anyone wants to ask them themselves or if you prefer me to run through them. I believe, Deborah, you asked the first question. Would you like me just to run through it, or are you okay asking the question?
Yeah, I can ask. I believe my first question was just who funded the project, and I think it's probably because I didn't pay attention at the beginning. It's presumably the company that was had the damages assessed. Is that right? That
is correct. That is correct.
Okay. And my other question was about health and safety plans that your Stantec, if you still work for Stantec, required you to implement for using your kayak, because I've thought about using kayaks on certain projects, and the getting that approved is kind of onerous.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. The health and safety here was really extraordinary. What you don't see is that there are health and safety professionals not only watching the contractor, but also on guard, and their sole job was to check on anybody in the water with lifelines and ways to propel out life preservers and stuff. Now, I happen to be a very experienced kayaker and did all of the requisite water safety training, was rarely in the water, certainly not during the active equipment. I was either downstream or upstream. You never go alone, of course. Couldn't find many people to kayak with me, but always had someone there to, if I went out, that they had a lifeline. So Stantec and the former company that I did with, the company that Stantec bought, which was MWH, took very seriously the health and safety considerations, as does my client, who had their own health and safety representative, like a third party of a third party. I'm happy to say that there were no incidences in any of the 4 projects, but it was a rigorous risk review and health and safety process, including everything that you folks do, which is morning tailgates and checks in the middle of the day and stand downs and change conditions. So I was very comfortable with the health and safety that we implemented.
Thanks for answering that, John. And I believe my question was the next one, so I'll go ahead and ask it. Does the removal of the dam, or had the removal of the dam led to any increased riverbank erosion? And if so, what's the follow-up associated with this removal of this size?
Yeah, there really wasn't, because the river comes in. And so actually we get reduced bank erosion because now the river is, I guess, narrower than it started. And when we dig that thalweg, there's one thing about the Raritan, it's almost like it's pavement. It's very cobbly. So once we established the thalweg, we found that there was very little head cutting going on. When we reconnected those channels, I suppose in a hurricane that we've had since, multiple hurricanes, there may have been more sediment that's been picked up in the impoundment and delivered downstream, not that you would be able to notice, but we actually had less bank erosion because we actually reconnected the river, whereas there was a lot of cut banks because of the impoundment and waves washing up against the banks in an impoundment. So we actually saw an incidence of reduced bank erosion for the removals.
Impressive. And Now that you mentioned that word thalwag, I was wondering if you could define that, because you had mentioned it in the presentation. I didn't want to interrupt.
Yeah, it's just basically, it's a fancy $10 term for hydrologists, I suppose. It's basically the centerline axis of the deepest portion of the river. It's where most of the river flows in the channel. It's the midpoint of the channel, the deepest midpoint of the channel. And I use the term, I probably should have defined it, is if you can, let's say you're at elevation 34 upstream, elevation 33 downstream, but the dam is up at elevation 20 because of all the impoundment. If you can dig out the dam and get down to elevation, 33.5 in the middle of the dam, connect it upstream to the 34 elevation and connect it downstream to the 33 elevation, you have now reconnected the channel. You've reconnected the circuit that the river wants to put about 85% of its flow in.
Understood. Thanks for that clarification. I think the next question we had was from Laurel. Laurel, if you want to ask your question.
Yes. So I was wondering, while you were using the heavy machinery to break up the concrete, that was obviously creating smaller pieces to fly off, and also dust. I was wondering if there was a plan that you had to implement, or regulations that you had to fulfill for dust mitigation or sediment in the water itself for downstream. You may have covered this.
Excellent question. Oh, no, excellent question. The sediment scouring analysis that we had to perform, we had to predict the volume of sediment that was going to go into the water during the dam breach, because now you're putting current through the impoundment, which is mounded sediment, and now you're releasing it downstream. There's a de minimis amount that you're allowed to discharge, and that also includes the dust that settles. Now, of course, we had health and safety protocols and air monitors. The dust was more of a health and safety concern, not an ecological concern, because we knew that it wouldn't go down very far. But it was included in the amount of quote unquote sediment that we were all able to discharge downstream. But you bring up an excellent point. You may wonder about the timing of this. It isn't just the river's flow, which has to be at a certain level or lower. There's also a time of year where this is an accepted activity. It cannot be during the months of January through August 1st, because fish, not just migratory fish, but native fish, are nesting in the river. And you don't want any excess sediment moving downstream. Even an allowable amount, you don't want that covering a fish nest. Now, I had no migratory. I was not going to make the esoteric technical argument that, gee, I have no migratory fish, so I should be able to work any time of the year. That would have been disingenuous. I did appreciate the fact that native fish, even though much of it was stock trout, was using the river downstream for reproduction. That reproduction ceases by midsummer. And so we are allowed a de minimis amount of sediment to be discharged a couple hundred feet from the dam, including the dust that settles, because even though, yes, it will settle on the riverbed, it's not interfering with any biotic activity and then would be recolonized the next year. But the reason dam safety is at your hip during all of this is that they're reviewing your breaching calculations and they're deciding what the acceptable amount of sediment movement is. By the way, if you can do zero sediment transport, and I've done this in one case where it was so fine-grained upstream of Weston Mill that no breaching calculation that I could come up with got me to a de minimis amount. So I excavated out the impoundment first, so that when the breach took place, there was no sediment moving through the breach. And so that's your backup. And by the way, they did allow me the dust, though. That was below the de minimis. So long answer to your question, but an excellent question, that the HECRAS model that you're running is primarily to figure out the best time to breach the dam, and also getting agreement and consensus on the amount of sediment that is allowable to be discharged downstream.
Thank you.
I believe the next question was from Eileen. Eileen, are you still on the chat?
Yes, I
Awesome.
am. Hi, this is Eileen Snyder. So I guess my question is two-part. One is, what does the long-term monitoring program look like? The elements, and then the second part, how do you define success? You mentioned, a long river with multiple dams. So I'm assuming it's not just, the shad show up because maybe they can't
right.
other dams. So like, how do you define your outcome?
Excellent question. Early on in the process, because we felt like it was important to demonstrate success. Now, my client did not want to have to do that on every removal. We thought that if we could establish success in the first removal, that would set the template. And so there was a pre and post monitoring phase on both water quality and fish populations. We actually teamed with Fish and Wildlife out of New Jersey on the latter portion of this because they're rather accustomed to going out and shocking fish and counting. But in one case, we had watershed, the Stony Brook Millstone watershed helped us with doing DO and other water quality parameters before and after the removal to show that the water quality parameters were improving, or at least staying stable if they were good. And then my client funded a study because we wanted to let the state really had to have a stake in the success. So even though they do fish shocking and counting, as a general rule, we funded them to go upstream of one of the dams a year before the removal and then a year after the removal to do a fish count. That alone, that study proved what I think everybody knew was going to be the result, which was higher water quality, higher DO, less of this impounding of phosphates and nitrates, but also we saw the first shad in the river since the dam had been constructed, because they had years of data from a particular stretch of river where they never counted a single shad. We also had the benefit of having a fish ladder upstream that virtually wasn't getting any fish in it around one of the dams. And then next year, following the first removal, shad began to show up in hundreds and hundreds, whereas the year before, I believe there were 6. So we demonstrated on the initial project the positive consequences, and therefore the state, I guess you could say, relieved us of the responsibility of having to have performance criteria on the other removals, because the first one proved, I guess it was proof of concept. And by the way, dam removals have been proven to be successful ever since American Rivers began doing them in 1999. But you ask an excellent question. Where's the proof of concept on the Raritan? How do we know this river is going to respond like the rivers in Maine or the rivers in Connecticut? I think we demonstrated that with our first monitoring program, and therefore we no longer have, we're still seeing that performance, but we don't have to document it on future removals.
Great. This is Eileen Snyder again. Can I ask another question?
Sure.
What type of permitting effort did you have to undertake? For example, like how many different bureaus within the department did you have to engage with on permitting?
Oh, excellent question. So there were 5 generally permits. And I don't say them in any particular order, but dam safety is always the one that I think about because they're the lead permitting. So a dam safety permit through the Bureau of Dam Safety. You obviously don't do anything in New Jersey, as you know, without land use. And so there was a land use permit that we had to do for dam removal. It was actually a permit, a general permit in their rule. So we had to do a land use permit, a dam safety permit. There also was, and it was a very simple permit, the Division of Fish and Wildlife had a water lowering permit. That was very simple. They just simply want to know when you're doing it and how you're permanently changing the water elevation. And then because some of these projects happened within the Delaware and Raritan Canal Commission zone, We had a DNR Canal Commission application and a special use permit application because, as you know, there's an overlap between the Division of Parks and Forestry and the Delaware and Raritan Canal Commission. And so those were, I guess, permits 4 and 5. And then, as you might suspect, certain townships, like Hillsborough, for example, required a local permit for construction. Of course, those forms are interesting to fill out because they're mostly for houses. And so they wanted to know what kind of house I was building. And I really wasn't building a house. So I had to do a lot of in-person work. So there were some local, and then of course you have your sediment and erosion controls if you have a large footprint. But relative, I would say relative to other projects that you might be working on that might include stream encroachment or a construction in a floodway, the permitting was relatively painless, largely because each of these agencies, Land Use Division, Bureau of Dam Safety and the Division of Fish and Wildlife were all on board in the pre-application meeting for the removal of these structures. And then of course, as you know very well, attached to that land use regulation permit is the CFR Part 800, the protection of historical properties, the Section 106 process it's called. And so that was also, I guess you could say, 5.5 permits, because you feel like when you do those SHPA things, they're their own little project that eventually gets included with the land use permit. But excellent question.
So it sounds like the pre-application meeting was critical to get everybody to the table and on the same page.
Absolutely. There's no substitute for that meeting because everybody knows it's coming. They know the time constraints that I'm under, that I only have a 6-week window to remove dams. And I don't even have to say to them, hey, if it's June and you haven't looked at this, if you don't look at it in the next week, I'm going to miss my window. So that actually never had to be spoken out loud. And if I had my applications in by the December before, I had everything by the following June. Are there any other questions that folks might have? I know we've run over, but I've really enjoyed these questions.
Yeah, and thank you for sticking around for QA. I think our last question was from Lisa, if you want to ask your question.
Yeah, sure. So it was actually a bit of a follow-up on Eileen's first question, and it was how quickly does the dam tend to normalize to, I don't know if you would want to call it pre-dam health, but you kind of have those initial benefits. When does it really start to even out and be the way that it will be in the future?
Excellent question. In the NRD calculations that I did, I gave the river 5 years to reach 100% service. Unlike a wetland, which incrementally over time, I'd have to show you a curve, but if you're trying to demonstrate that you're having ecological uplift, there's a year-to-year trend of increased uplift, and then it plateaus at the level that you were aiming for. We felt that, and it was proven by the fish study. I mean, if you're getting fish the following migration season, it justified my assumption that 75% of the uplift occurred in year 1, but that you needed another 4 years to achieve that other 25%, because you needed riparian vegetation to occupy the former impoundment. You had to have, fish begin to occupy nests and find places where they're accustomed to migrate during the summer months. And so I think we probably did better than that, but I was happy with the 5-year prediction that we made.
All right, I think that was all of the questions. Just want to give you a virtual round of applause. That was a really impressive and well put together presentation, and it's definitely not something you see every day. So thank you for taking the time to come out today. If there are no further
I'm very pleased.
questions, John, if you have no further comments, I think we are set to go. Everyone, John's YouTube videos, we put the links in the chat if you want to check out more information. Thanks again, John, and everyone have a great afternoon.
Thank you.